Billionaire CEO canceled his wedding a day before after his ex accidentally sent him a photo of a baby he knew nothing about. Kendall Kremen had purchased the penthouse because it made a statement. Floor-to-ceiling glass, Italian stone counters, climate-controlled wine wall, and a view that allowed him to look down on Manhattan like a private map of conquest. It was designed to impress investors, journalists, and guests who never stayed long enough to notice the quiet. Tonight, it did not impress him at all. The bedroom lights were off except for a narrow strip along the ceiling. Beyond the glass wall, the city glowed in soft grids of white and amber, distant traffic sliding through avenues like mechanical veins. He could hear none of it. The windows sealed out every sound, leaving the room suspended in a silence that felt less like peace and more like vacancy. His wedding suit hung on the closet door. It was custom-tailored, flown in from Milan, adjusted by 3 different professionals whose job was to ensure that nothing about him appeared accidental tomorrow. It waited there without a crease, untouched, like something borrowed for a life he was no longer sure he recognized. He stood barefoot on the marble floor, hands loose at his sides, unable to remember how long he had been there. He had dismissed the staff early, no assistant, no security detail outside the bedroom door. He had wanted one night with no one watching, no one scheduling, no one managing the edges of his life. The strange part was not the nerves. Weddings carried pressure. He understood pressure. The strange part was the absence of anticipation. There should have been excitement in his chest. Relief, at least obligation. Instead, there was only a quiet weight, the same one that had followed him through meetings, interviews, and celebratory dinners for longer than he wanted to admit. Tomorrow he would marry Nellie Wuckert, a woman admired by his board, approved by his publicists, adored by every publication that followed his career. They called them a modern empire couple. Power, elegance, reach, no scandals, no instability. He had said all the right things when people congratulated him. He had smiled when cameras angled for sincerity. He had even believed it at first, when the idea of settling into a future that no one could criticize felt like relief. But standing there now, he could not remember the last time he had been alone with Nellie in a room that didn't feel like a performance. The penthouse had been meant to symbolize arrival. Tonight it felt like a waiting area for a life he hadn't agreed to fully enter. The first vibration came from the marble counter near the bed. Kendall didn't move. His phone had been lighting up all evening with last-minute confirmations, florist timing, transportation updates, messages from people who wanted reassurance that tomorrow would happen exactly as planned. He had muted nearly all of them hours earlier. Whatever this was, it could wait. The second vibration was longer, louder, the device skidding slightly across the smooth surface before stopping near the edge. He exhaled slowly through his nose, irritation tightening his jaw. There were very few people who didn't understand boundaries, fewer still who would contact him this late without going through his assistant. His world had been built on controlled access. Nothing reached him unless he allowed it. A third vibration followed almost immediately. Not a call, a text. He turned from the glass wall and crossed the room, the chill of the marble faint under his feet. The screen glowed as he picked it up. No name, no company logo, just a sequence of numbers he didn't recognize. Spam, he assumed, or a misdirected message from someone who had typed the wrong digit. He considered deleting it without opening it. He had done it hundreds of times before, but something about the timing, the persistence, made him pause. The wedding schedule echoed faintly in his head, a checklist of obligations stacked too tightly to breathe around. He tapped the screen. The message hadn't loaded yet, just a blank bubble with a loading icon rotating in place, as if whatever waited on the other side was too large to be rushed. For the first time all night, the silence in the room shifted. Kendall leaned his hip against the counter and waited, phone in hand, irritation giving way to curiosity he hadn't planned to feel. The image appeared all at once, filling the screen so completely that his own reflection vanished from the glass. A child, wrapped in a pale blue blanket, the fabric folded carefully around a body no larger than a loaf of bread. The baby's eyes were open, unfocused in that searching way newborns carry, as if the world had not yet decided how to shape itself around them. One hand pushed free of the blanket, fingers curled inward, resting near his face. There was no caption, no context. No reason it should exist on Kendall's phone at all. His first reaction was confusion edged with irritation. Parents misdirect photos every day. Someone had typed the wrong number, nothing more. He moved his thumb toward the back arrow, already dismissing the interruption. But he didn't close it. Something held him there, not sentiment, not recognition, just an unsettled stillness that slipped beneath his usual detachment. He enlarged the image slightly. The lighting was soft, natural, probably near a window. The blanket wasn't hospital issue. Someone had chosen it. This wasn't a stock image. This wasn't a mistake that could be brushed aside. He studied the child's face, telling himself that babies looked alike, that it was coincidence to feel anything at all. Yet his chest tightened with a sensation that had no place in the logic he depended on. This wasn't meant for him, and still, it was here. A second bubble appeared beneath the photo, short, direct, unsettling. "I'm sorry. This wasn't meant for you." No explanation followed. No name. No apology beyond the sentence itself. Just that. A quiet admission that the image had landed in the wrong place, in the wrong life, at the worst possible moment. Kendall read it twice, then a third time, the words refusing to soften no matter how he angled the phone. Whoever had sent it knew immediately that a boundary had been crossed. They also knew enough to be careful. His irritation returned, sharper now. He typed a reply he never sent, erased it, started again. "You have the wrong number. Delete. Too dismissive. Please don't send private photos to this line. Delete. Too defensive." Finally, he settled on something restrained. "Who is this?" He didn't add punctuation. He didn't offer courtesy. He pressed send and locked the phone, as if looking at the screen longer might pull him into a situation he had no interest in understanding. The device was back on the counter when he realized his hands were no longer steady. The reply took longer than he expected, long enough for him to walk back to the glass wall, long enough to remind himself that tomorrow's ceremony required him to be rested, composed, fully available to a future that had already been arranged. His phone lit again. This time there was a name, Valerie Chesley. The room seemed to contract around him, not physically, but in the way a thought can narrow the air in your chest. He hadn't seen that name in years, hadn't searched it, hadn't said it aloud. Some parts of life were easier to leave untouched than resolved. The message beneath it was simple. "I didn't mean to send that to you. Please ignore it. Ignore it." As if that were possible. He stared at the screen until the words blurred. 6 years collapsed into a single beat of memory. The crooked Brooklyn loft, the chipped mugs, the nights when ambition had still felt like a shared adventure instead of a solitary obligation. He hadn't known where she was, hadn't asked. He told himself that closure was overrated, that some chapters ended without commentary. Yet here she was in the last hours before his wedding, connected to a child he could not explain, and a photograph he couldn't forget. He typed again. "Valerie, who is the baby?" This time he didn't lock the phone. While he waited, Kendall lowered himself onto the edge of the bed. The mattress barely shifted beneath his weight, engineered comfort, built to support without presence. He held the phone loosely, not reading anything now, just staring at the earlier photo as if it might change. The child's eyes were still open in the frame, caught between curiosity and confusion, unaware that he had just crossed into a life that wasn't prepared for him. This wasn't nostalgia. This wasn't regret. It was intrusion, a reality that didn't belong to his calendar, his future announcements, or the life he had negotiated so carefully over the years. Everything he was supposed to be thinking about tonight had been replaced by a face that shouldn't exist in his world at all. Some moments don't arrive loudly. They arrive quietly and refuse to leave. He had built a company from nothing. He had navigated hostile acquisitions and public scrutiny. He had never once felt this defenseless in front of a screen. The image didn't accuse him. It didn't ask anything. It simply waited, impossible to dismiss. Kendall shifted back against the headboard, gaze lifting from the phone to the darkened ceiling. He tried to collect himself, to return to the emotional distance that had served him so well. But a question had already formed in the quiet. How many people live inside lives that look complete from the outside and hollow from within? He had spent years constructing a version of himself that required no explanation. The press knew the highlights. His colleagues knew the strategy. His fiancée knew the schedule. Yet none of them knew what it felt like to stand alone in a room that had been designed for celebration and feel absolutely no desire to celebrate. Maybe the discomfort wasn't about the photo at all. Maybe it was about the ease with which one unexpected moment had displaced everything he had been told to value, the luxury, the approval, the future that had been drafted for him in boardrooms and glossy interviews. What if the life you fought to build stops feeling like yours the moment you finally finish building it? The clock on the nightstand read 11:48 p.m. 12 hours from now, a ballroom would fill with people who had purchased new clothes for the occasion. There would be music selected by committee, flowers imported overnight, speeches edited to avoid offense. Every step between this room and that altar had already been charted. His phone remained silent. No reply from Valerie. No clarification. No reassurance that this was some harmless misunderstanding that could be folded neatly back into the night. He imagined his assistant's calendar for tomorrow: hair at 7, rehearsal by 9, photographs by 11. Each appointment represented a version of himself that could still exist, provided he chose not to ask any more questions. But the questions had already taken root. Who was the child? Why had Valerie been the one to send the photo? And why did the waiting feel heavier than the wedding itself? Kendall rose and crossed the room again, not because he needed to be anywhere else, but because standing still had become unbearable. The penthouse had never felt small before. Tonight, every polished surface seemed to remind him of decisions made long ago and never revisited. His phone remained in his hand, the screen dark now, concealing a reality he was no longer free to avoid. One message, one image. That was all it had taken to fracture a future that had been assembled piece by piece over years. Somewhere across the city, Valerie was holding a child he had never met. By morning, he would have to decide whether to protect the life he had built, or confront the one that had just announced itself without permission. Before you settle in, take a moment to support Mr. Cooper's stories by subscribing to the channel and sharing this video with someone who appreciates meaningful storytelling. And while you're here, leave a comment below. Do you believe the past deserves another opportunity when it arrives at the worst possible time, or should some chapters remain closed no matter how loudly they return? Morning entered Kendall Kremen's life without ceremony. There was no alarm clock. His internal rhythm had been trained into reliability long ago, the way some people condition themselves for endurance sports. At 5:45 a.m., his eyes opened automatically, not because he was rested, but because discipline had replaced instinct. The bedroom blinds slid upward at a preset pace, revealing a washed silver dawn over the river. He did not stretch. He did not linger. The idea of staying in bed longer than necessary felt indulgent, inefficient, almost irresponsible. He rose immediately, feet touching the chilled marble, posture straightening before awareness fully returned. The apartment was already awake in the ways that mattered to him. Climate adjusted, coffee brewing in the kitchen, news summaries cued silently on the living room screen, muted until he asked for them. His home was not a refuge. It was an extension of his office, responsive, quiet, obedient. He showered in under 4 minutes, not because he was in a hurry, but because he saw no value in excess. His wardrobe was organized by shade, fabric weight, and function. The suit he selected was charcoal, understated, indistinguishable from a dozen others he owned. Choice had been engineered out of the process. By the time he entered the kitchen, the coffee machine was finishing its cycle. He poured without sitting down, standing at the counter while the city outside shifted from gray to pale gold. The silence in the penthouse was deliberate. He had long ago disabled all ambient sound features. Music distracted. Conversation could wait. Mornings were reserved for alignment, body, schedule, objectives. He opened his tablet and scanned the overnight reports from his European teams. Margins, projections, acquisition updates. Each line item represented motion in a life that never paused long enough to ask where it was headed. There was no personal message waiting for him. That absence went unnoticed, as it always did. By 6:30 a.m., Kendall was seated at the long dining table that rarely hosted meals. The surface was clear except for his tablet and a single folder his assistant had left overnight. Embossed on the front were the words "Ceremony Overview." The font was elegant, conservative, chosen to project stability. He didn't open it. Instead, he checked the calendar on his tablet. His wedding appeared in the same neutral format as quarterly earnings calls and shareholder briefings. 10 a.m., final rehearsal 12 p.m., media availability 3 p.m., ceremony. The alignment was not accidental. Nellie understood optics. Her family understood influence. Their engagement had been announced after careful timing with both of their teams. Positioned as the union of two disciplined people who knew how to manage a future. They were compatible on paper. She was intelligent, poised, uncontroversial. She spoke well in interviews and never strayed from the narratives their publicists prepared. Together they made sense to people who didn't believe relationships needed mystery, only order. When Kendall thought about Nellie, the feeling was not affection or doubt. It was practicality. She fit into the framework he had built. She didn't disrupt his habits. She didn't ask for things he couldn't schedule. That was the agreement, even if they never spoke it aloud. By 8 o'clock, Kendall was already trending in financial circles. His media team forwarded a preview of the morning coverage to his tablet before he left the apartment. The headline was predictable. A model of modern leadership prepares for his biggest day. The article praised his restraint, his vision, his consistency. It referenced childhood hardship, the self-made narrative, the disciplined approach to relationships. The engagement was framed as proof that stability had finally completed the picture. Kendall read the first paragraph, then closed it. The man described in the article existed. He simply did not occupy the same space Kendall did. That version of him never hesitated before major decisions, never questioned alignment, never sat alone in rooms that cost more than entire buildings he'd lived in once and wondered why they felt so bare. He slipped his phone into his jacket pocket without checking for messages. The headlines would tell their story regardless of how he felt about them. Before leaving, Kendall walked once more through the apartment, not inspecting it, but registering it the way one registers a hotel room they've stayed in too often. Every surface was immaculate, nothing out of place, no personal clutter, no framed photos, no half-read books left behind on tables. It had been designed by a firm that specialized in executive residences, spaces that communicated success without revealing anything about the person inside them. From the hallway window, he watched the doorman below greet tenants with a politeness that never crossed into familiarity. Even here, there were layers of separation, carefully maintained. The penthouse didn't remind him of what he had accomplished. It reminded him of how well he had learned to live without interruption. The elevator ride down was silent except for the soft hum of motion. Kendall watched the numbers descend without really seeing them. His reflection in the mirrored panel looked the same as always, rested, composed, unremarkable in the way executives train themselves to be. Yet something in his posture felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't exhaustion in the physical sense. His body functioned perfectly. He slept. He ate well. He followed every protocol recommended by people whose entire careers revolved around prolonging performance. Still, there were mornings when the weight settled in before the day had even begun, as if his system were running on momentum alone. He straightened his shoulders just as the doors opened. The habit was automatic. There would be greetings in the lobby, a driver waiting at the curb, questions about logistics. No one needed to see whatever it was that lingered beneath the surface. The driver opened the door before Kendall reached the curb. He nodded once, slipped into the back seat, and gave the address for his office without ceremony. The car pulled into traffic, gliding past storefronts that had once been part of a life he no longer visited. His phone rested in his palm, screen dark. He didn't check it. He told himself he was conserving attention for the day ahead, but the truth was simpler. There were names he had trained himself not to search for, memories he had stored in places he never reopened. Valerie was one of them, a chapter closed not by conflict but by neglect. The vehicle stopped at a light. Pedestrians crossed in clusters, laughing, arguing, holding hands, absorbed in worlds that didn't include market valuation or shareholder expectation. Kendall looked away before the light changed. The boardroom meeting ended on schedule. It always did. His leadership team dispersed with their folders neatly aligned, each executive already dialing into the next obligation. Kendall remained seated for a moment after the room cleared, hands folded on the polished table, eyes on nothing in particular. Only when the door shut did he reach for his phone. The photo reopened instantly, as if it had been waiting. He enlarged it until the child's face filled the screen edge to edge. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that he couldn't stop looking. The blanket's weave was visible now, soft cotton, pale blue, lightly textured. The baby's skin carried a warm undertone, not the flush redness he had seen in hospital brochures. There was a faint crease above the left eyebrow, barely there, as though the face had been caught mid-thought. It irritated him that his mind had shifted into analysis mode, the same pattern recognition he used when reviewing contracts. He tried to dismiss it as instinct misfiring in unfamiliar territory. Children resembled everyone. That was the rational position. Yet the longer he held the phone, the more the details refused to remain neutral. He lowered the brightness on the screen and typed with his thumb, careful not to let impatience shape the words. "Valerie, it's Kendall. I think you sent something meant for someone else." He paused, then added a second line. "Is everything all right?" The cursor blinked at the end of the sentence. He deleted the period, then replaced it. The hesitation annoyed him. He had negotiated hostile takeovers with less uncertainty than he felt now over 2 sentences. He sent the message and placed the phone face down on the table, as if turning it over might keep the moment contained. It didn't. His attention drifted for the rest of the afternoon. Numbers blurred, voices receded into background noise. Somewhere between one agenda item and the next, he realized he was waiting, not professionally but personally, in a way that made him uneasy. By the time Kendall returned to his penthouse, the sun was already sliding behind the skyline. He removed his jacket without switching on the lights, moving through the dark with the confidence of routine. His phone remained silent. He checked it once while pouring a glass of water. No new notifications, no name on the screen. Just the same photo waiting in his gallery, refusing to fade into irrelevance. An hour passed, then another. He didn't pace. He didn't rehearse conversations. He simply existed in a space that felt subtly altered by absence, as though time itself had slowed in expectation of something it had not yet received. He wondered if she had changed her number, if the message had gone into a void that would never answer back. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The response arrived while Kendall was standing at the kitchen counter, the city lights flickering on beyond the glass. His name is Miles. No greeting, no preamble. Just a sentence that introduced a person into Kendall's life, as if the name alone were sufficient explanation. He read it once, then again, searching for the context that wasn't there. Miles. He had expected a correction, perhaps an apology. Instead, he was being offered a name, an entry point into a story he had never known existed. His reply formed slowly. Who is Miles? He didn't add anything else. Whatever boundary still separated him from this moment felt thin enough already. Kendall set the phone down and leaned back against the counter, arms crossed as if bracing against a sudden draft. There were explanations that did not involve him. Valerie could have become a mother after their separation. The timing would make sense. 6 years was more than enough space for an entirely new life to take shape. The child in the photo could belong to someone else entirely, someone who resembled him in a way his mind had exaggerated. This was the logical route. It protected the structure of his present and required no revisions to the plans already in motion. Yet logic was proving to be a poor shield. The image resurfaced behind his eyes with quiet persistence, the slight crease in the baby's brow, the way the fingers curled near his cheek. Details that refused to remain incidental. He picked up the phone again, not because he had received another message, but because curiosity had outpaced restraint. Before the story continues, pause for a moment. How do you handle the parts of your life that never received an ending? The conversations that were postponed, the people you stopped checking on, the choices that were made quietly and left unresolved. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you haven't already, support Mr. Cooper Stories by liking this video so more people can find stories that speak to real moments like this. Kendall walked into the bedroom and reached for the garment bag hanging from the closet door. He hadn't intended to touch it, but his body moved before the decision caught up. He unzipped the bag and lifted the tuxedo jacket free, the fabric heavier than it looked. The tailoring was flawless. He slid one arm into the sleeve, then the other, testing the weight of a roll he was supposed to wear tomorrow. His phone vibrated in his hand. The movement startled him enough that the jacket slipped from his shoulder and slid to the floor in a soft, unceremonious heap. He didn't pick it up. For the first time since the photo appeared, he understood that something essential had shifted, not in his schedule, but in the way he occupied his own life. Before the penthouse, before the executive drivers and security clearances, Kendall lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a bakery in Brooklyn. The floor slanted just enough that furniture had to be braced with folded paper. The radiator hissed in winter, loud enough to interrupt phone calls. The windows rattled whenever delivery trucks passed too close to the curb. It was imperfect in ways he would later spend a fortune to avoid. But it had been alive. Valerie had found the place after a week of climbing narrow staircases and peering into half-renovated spaces with landlords who promised more than they delivered. When she finally signed the lease, she brought Kendall there without ceremony, dropped her bag on the floor, and said, "This is where we start." They didn't own much. A small table with uneven legs, 2 mismatched chairs, a mattress that had been carried up 4 flights of stairs by friends who expected pizza in return. Yet the apartment never felt empty. Evenings arrived with the smell of bread drifting through the floorboards. Kendall would sit at the table with his laptop open, surrounded by printouts, trying to convince investors he was more than a theory. Valerie moved through the room without disrupting him, setting mugs near his elbow, humming quietly as she tidied things that didn't need tidying. That was where the future had once felt close enough to touch. Kendall worked constantly in those years, not out of greed but urgency. He believed momentum was fragile, that every hour not spent pushing forward was a step backward. Valerie was the only one who seemed immune to his panic. When he spoke too quickly about valuations and pitch decks, she would interrupt with a question that had nothing to do with business. What had he eaten that day? Whether he had slept? If he remembered the name of the neighbor downstairs who kept burning toast? She didn't compete with his ambition. She adjusted it. On nights when he came home carrying rejection in his shoulders, she didn't try to repair it. She handed him a mug, leaned against the counter, and said nothing until his breathing slowed. Only then would she remind him that momentum wasn't measured in press coverage. With her, his future felt wide instead of narrow. They developed habits without planning them. Coffee at midnight, even when they both knew they'd regret it in the morning. Valerie perched on the counter with her legs swinging slightly while Kendall sorted through code or budget sheets at the table. They spoke in fragments, half-finished ideas, questions that didn't require answers, jokes that wouldn't make sense to anyone else. Sometimes they talked about the lives they imagined. Not in grand terms, but in specifics. A place with windows that actually closed, a kitchen big enough to cook in without bumping elbows, a schedule that allowed for weekends. Other nights they said very little, content to share the same small room without filling it with noise. It was ordinary. It was enough. The changes arrived quietly. Kendall's phone started interrupting dinner. Then it started interrupting sleep. The company's needs expanded beyond the small table in Brooklyn, pulling him into rooms Valerie never saw and conversations she wasn't invited into. He still came home. He still kissed her when he entered the apartment. But his attention began to split, as if his body was present while his mind kept running ahead to whatever waited next. Valerie noticed before he did. She would pause mid-sentence when his eyes drifted to the screen in his hand. She began asking fewer questions about the company, not because she cared less, but because she could feel how little space remained for anything else. Nothing dramatic happened. No arguments, just a gradual thinning of the air between them. It happened on a Sunday morning. There were no raised voices, no accusations waiting to be launched. Valerie was sitting at the table with her coffee untouched, staring at a crack in the wall they always joked about fixing someday. "I don't think we're going in the same direction anymore," she said. Kendall started to answer, already preparing a defense he didn't believe in. She stopped him with a small shake of her head. "I don't need you to change," she continued. "I just need you to choose, and I don't think you're choosing me." They hugged in the doorway when he left, longer than people who are certain should. Then the door closed, and with it, the version of himself that still knew how to stay. For a long time afterward, Kendall treated the breakup like a necessary expense. Growth demanded sacrifice. Progress required focus. Those were the terms he accepted without hesitation. It wasn't until years later, standing in rooms filled with people who applauded his every decision, that the cost became visible. He had achieved everything he once described as temporary goals. He had replaced the crooked floors with imported stone, the chipped mugs with custom glassware, the uncertain future with predictable certainty. What he hadn't replaced was the ease with which he had once been known. The realization arrived slowly, not as regret, but recognition. Some things don't disappear when you leave them. They simply wait, unchanged, until you understand what you lost. They chose a cafe in Midtown that neither of them had ever visited. It was clean, anonymous, loud enough that no one would pay attention to two people sitting too long over untouched drinks. Kendall arrived early, out of habit. He took the seat facing the door and ordered black coffee he didn't drink. His phone rested face up on the table, screen blank, as if he needed proof that the meeting was real. When Valerie entered, he almost didn't recognize her. She wore a gray coat too light for the season, her hair pulled back without the care she used to take. She moved carefully, not with weakness, but with the economy of someone who had learned to preserve energy. She scanned the room once, then spotted him. There was no greeting, no smile, just a quiet acknowledgement as she approached the table carrying a soft carrier against her chest. They sat in silence for several seconds, the clatter of cups and distant conversations filling the space they didn't. Valerie unfastened the strap of the carrier and shifted it to the seat beside her. Her movements were steady, practiced, as though she had performed them without assistance countless times. "I didn't know how else to handle this," she said at last, voice level, not defensive. "I wasn't trying to interfere with your life." Kendall watched her hands more than her face. There was no edge in her tone, no rehearsal of grievances. Only fatigue, the kind that comes from responsibility carried alone. He realized then that this wasn't a confrontation. It was an offering. Valerie turned the carrier toward him and folded the cover back. The baby was awake. His eyes moved slowly, following the shapes above him without urgency. Kendall didn't lean closer at first. He remained still, as if sudden motion might break whatever fragile permission had allowed him to be here. He'd prepared for this moment in theory, imagined it in fragments, but nothing had equipped him for the weight of standing face to face with a person whose existence he had never suspected. Neither of them spoke. The room continued around them, but the sound receded until all Kendall could register was the rise and fall of a chest no larger than his palm. Kendall extended his hand without thinking, resting his finger lightly against the edge of the blanket. He hadn't planned to touch him. The movement was instinctive, unfiltered. Miles's hand closed around it. The grip was not strong, but it was decisive. 5 tiny fingers forming a boundary he hadn't known he needed. His breath stalled in his throat. It was an irrational reaction, but he felt as though something had been claimed, not possession, but recognition. A silent exchange that required no explanation. Valerie watched him carefully, as if gauging whether this moment would be too much or not enough. The question he can't avoid asking. Kendall withdrew his hand slowly, not because he wanted to, but because he needed the distance to speak. "How old is he?" he asked. 6 months, Valerie replied. The answer settled heavily between them. It was precise, it carried history. He nodded once, then looked back at the child. "And he's—" The rest of the sentence didn't form. It didn't need to. Valerie didn't answer right away. She studied the table, the edge of her cup, anything but his face. When she finally looked up, there was no plea in her eyes, only resolution. "You were building something that mattered to you," she said softly. "I didn't want to interrupt it. I thought I could manage on my own." She reached into the carrier and adjusted the blanket around Miles, a small protective motion that carried more meaning than the words. "I never expected that photo to end up with you," she added. "I wasn't trying to reopen anything." Kendall lowered his gaze to the child again, understanding for the first time that silence too could shape a life. By the time Kendall returned to the penthouse, his phone had accumulated 14 missed calls. Every one of them was from Nellie. He didn't open the voicemail inbox. He already knew the tone. Measured concern first, then confusion, then a careful edge that suggested panic was being contained for public safety. Her last message had arrived while he was still in the cafe, but he had silenced the device before it could vibrate again. The screen kept lighting up in his pocket as he crossed the living room, but he ignored it, setting the phone face down on the counter as if that could halt the pressure accumulating beneath the glass. This wasn't neglect. It was avoidance. A pause before the structure he had spent months reinforcing began to show fractures he could no longer conceal. The first call from the board came less than 10 minutes later. He let it ring out, then another followed, this time from the firm's communications director. The wedding had never been a private matter. It was part of a narrative his company had sold about stability and forward motion. A text appeared from one of the senior partners. "We need confirmation. Media is waiting." Kendall didn't reply. He stared at the words until the screen dimmed, aware that every unanswered message was compounding a problem he had no intention of solving in the way they expected. He walked into the bedroom and opened the top drawer of the dresser. The velvet box was where it had always been, angled slightly to the left, aligned with everything else in his life. He lifted the lid. The ring reflected the room's low light without emotion. Perfect cut, clean design. A purchase evaluated and approved by professionals whose job was to anticipate approval. He held it between his fingers and waited for sensation, doubt, grief, anything that might confirm the significance of the moment. There was nothing. The absence startled him more than panic ever could. He closed the box and sat at the edge of the bed, shoulders rounding slightly as the posture he maintained in public finally gave way. Everything he had built relied on consistency. Predictable behavior. Agreements honored regardless of discomfort. He had never canceled a deal because it felt wrong. He had renegotiated, restructured, absorbed the cost, and moved forward. But this wasn't a contract. It was a life. One version required him to walk into a ballroom and perform certainty. The other required him to admit, privately at first, that certainty had been a costume he was no longer able to wear. He didn't weigh the options in terms of damage control. He weighed them in terms of honesty. Let's pause here. If you were standing where Kendall is right now, would you choose responsibility to others over responsibility to yourself? Or is there a moment when truth has to come first, no matter the fallout? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to like this video so more people can join the conversation. Kendall picked up his phone and opened Nellie's contact without scrolling through the call history. He didn't reread their old messages. He didn't soften the language. The text was short enough to fit on one line. "I'm sorry, I can't go through with this." He stared at it for several seconds, then pressed send before he could edit it into something that would lie for him. The screen went still. No confirmation. No echo. Just the knowledge that the future he had agreed to had now been formally declined. Kendall turned the phone off. The absence of vibration was immediate, unnatural, like stepping into a room after machinery has been shut down. He stood in the center of the bedroom with his hands at his sides, waiting for panic to arrive. It didn't. What came instead was quiet, not the hollow kind he lived with daily, but a steadiness he hadn't felt in years. No relief at having escaped obligation. No sense of triumph, just the end of pretending. Valerie left him with a list written on the back of a grocery receipt. It wasn't detailed, just times, quantities, reminders that assumed a level of familiarity Kendall did not possess. She handed it over without ceremony, as though she were leaving a neighbor with spare keys rather than placing a child into the care of someone who had only learned his name days earlier. Miles lay in the small portable crib Valerie had carried up to the apartment, eyes open, taking in the unfamiliar ceiling. Kendall stood beside him, arms folded, afraid to sit in case sitting required decisions. He checked the list again. Feeding schedule, bottle temperature. The note at the bottom read, "He'll tell you what he needs if you pay attention." The sentence unsettled him more than any instruction. By midnight, Kendall had memorized the sound of Miles's breathing. He paced the length of the living room with the child cradled against his shoulder, careful not to walk too quickly, afraid any shift in rhythm might disturb whatever fragile peace had settled over the apartment. He had opened 3 different browser tabs on his phone, feeding intervals, sleep cues, methods for calming restlessness, none of which gave him what he was actually searching for. There was no metric for certainty. He had always believed preparation could substitute for instinct. Tonight was proving otherwise. Valerie hadn't left the building. Kendall discovered this when he opened the door to take out a bag of trash and found her seated on the hallway bench across from his apartment, coat folded beside her. "I thought I'd give you some space," she said, rising slowly, "but I didn't want to be too far." She didn't step inside. She only leaned against the door frame, listening to the uneven cadence of Miles's breathing from within. "You're doing fine," she added, not as encouragement, but as observation. Kendall nodded, unsure whether the agreement was with her words or the fact that she was still nearby. The words came out without preparation. "I don't know how to be here," he said. Valerie didn't answer immediately. She waited, as though allowing the statement to settle into the room rather than bounce off it. "You don't have to know everything," she said. "You just have to stay." Kendall looked down at the child in his arms, surprised by how closely the phrase matched the unease he had been carrying since the cafe. Staying had never been his strength. Miles had been restless for nearly an hour when it happened, not crying, not calm, caught somewhere between the two, a soft whimper rising whenever Kendall paused his pacing. The apartment lights were dimmed, the city reduced to distant movement beyond the glass, but nothing Kendall tried seemed to register. Out of instinct rather than confidence, he sat on the couch and rested Miles against his chest, one hand supporting the small curve of his back. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply remained there, breathing slowly, counting the rise and fall until it matched his own. The sound faded first, then the tension in the tiny body eased. Kendall felt the weight change, not heavier, but settled, as if something had finally decided it was safe enough to release its hold. He stayed like that long after Miles was asleep, unwilling to disturb the quiet he hadn't known he was capable of creating. Kendall remained on the couch until the room felt different, not silent, but complete. He had built his life around achievement, around forward motion that left no time to reflect on what stayed behind. Tonight none of that applied. There were no outcomes to measure, no audience to satisfy, no reward to anticipate, just presence. He understood then that ambition had trained him to conquer distance, not inhabit it. It had prepared him to lead teams, close negotiations, manage perception, but it had not taught him how to hold something fragile without trying to control it. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing the next version of himself. He was learning how to remain. The weeks that followed did not feel like a reunion. There were no declarations, no dramatic shifts that could be captured in a single sentence. Kendall adjusted his schedule by degrees. A meeting moved here, a call declined there, until the empty spaces in his calendar began to mean something. Miles became part of the apartment without ceremony. Bottles shared counter space with imported glassware. The quiet he once cultivated was replaced by a new rhythm, uneven but real. Valerie came and went, not as someone reclaiming a place, but as someone testing whether one still existed. They spoke about logistics first, who would handle mornings, which days Kendall could commit to leaving the office before dark, before anything else was allowed to surface. Nothing was repaired. Everything was reconsidered. They talked at night when Miles finally slept, voices lowered not for secrecy, but respect for the fragile peace they were learning to maintain. Valerie admitted how close she had come to asking for help, and how often she had decided not to. Kendall spoke about the way his life had narrowed, until success felt more like containment than freedom. There were no apologies large enough to cover 6 years. There were only acknowledgments that they had chosen survival in different forms and paid for it in ways they hadn't understood at the time. They stood on the balcony late one evening, the city far beneath them, reduced to motion and light without detail. The door remained open behind them, Miles asleep inside, the apartment holding its breath in their absence. Neither of them spoke at first. They had learned that silence did not always require correction. Some truths needed room to surface on their own, without being named too quickly. Kendall rested his forearms on the railing, not looking at Valerie, not avoiding her either. Simply present, a posture he was only just learning to inhabit. "I don't want to do this the way I've done everything else," Kendall said quietly. Valerie turned toward him, waiting. "I don't need a flawless plan," he continued. "I need to be here, even when I don't understand what I'm doing." He didn't frame it as a promise. He framed it as intention, something that could be returned to when certainty faltered. The city continued below them, indifferent, while a different measure of success took hold above it. Valerie didn't answer right away. She studied him, not with skepticism, but with the caution of someone who had learned what hope could cost. When she finally spoke, her voice carried neither surrender nor resistance. "We'll see," she said. "That's all I can offer right now." It wasn't a rejection. It was permission to try. Kendall did not make an announcement. There was no press release, no carefully managed explanation distributed to the people who had once shaped his image. He simply began declining invitations that existed only to display him. Fewer keynote appearances, fewer closed-door dinners with people who spoke in projections rather than sentences. The board noticed, of course. They always did. But the changes were incremental enough to avoid alarm, a shift in tone rather than strategy. What mattered to Kendall wasn't how it looked. It was how it felt to no longer treat every room like a stage. His mornings changed first. The apartment no longer woke itself before he did. He disabled the automated blinds, set the coffee machine back to manual, and allowed the day to begin without choreography. Some mornings he woke before the city, Miles stirring in the small crib near the bed, the light outside still uncertain. He learned to measure time differently, not by meetings or market openings, but by moments of stillness that once would have unsettled him. The pace was slower, not because his responsibilities had disappeared, but because his attention had finally found somewhere to land. It wasn't a conclusion he reached all at once. There were still moments when the absence of the life he had prepared for caught him off guard. A quiet hour in the afternoon when his calendar should have been full, a message from someone who didn't yet know the ceremony had never taken place. But those moments no longer defined him. The child in his arms did. He had not stepped away from a commitment. He had stepped into one, not designed for display, not approved by committees, but alive in ways he had once forgotten how to recognize. Kendall no longer believed that achievement was a straight line. He saw now how easily direction could be mistaken for progress, how momentum could carry a person far from the reasons they started moving at all. Life had not dismantled his plans out of malice. It had adjusted them with precision, not to punish, but to realign. Some lessons do not arrive on schedule. They arrive when resistance finally loosens its hold. If this story spoke to you, take a moment to support Mr. Cooper's stories by subscribing to the channel and sharing this video with someone who values meaningful narratives. And let me ask you, What does real look like in your own life right now? Leave your thoughts in the comments.